In prevention, we are all leaders. Whether you're leading a nationwide prevention initiative, facilitating statewide prevention community, you're a coalition coordinator, or a one-person shop, you are a prevention leader. How we show up and how we engage with others to create positive change takes all types of leadership. So sit back and enjoy these conversations with your fellow prevention leaders from across the globe who are sharing their lessons learned, best practices, and strategies for success. Hey everybody, this is Dave Clausen from DJC Solutions, and you're listening to the Prevention Leaders Podcast, the show that brings you conversations with like-minded and driven prevention leaders from across the globe. But before we start the show, I want to tell you about my partners at Hue Life. They've got this upcoming Prevention Leaders Cohort in 2023. The insights and wisdom packed into this learning journey stem from over 25 years of combined experience in leading community coalitions in substance use and misuse. Today, we're talking about prevention, facilitation, and how to bring those two worlds together with the one and only Steve Miller and Angie Asa-Lovstad, who are prevention leaders and facilitator extraordinaires. We'll discuss everything there is to know about prevention, facilitation, and leadership. Y'all, thanks for joining us. Welcome, Angie. Welcome, Steve.
Good morning.
Morning. Thanks for having us.
Hey, all right. Hey, it's always great, though, when we can get together and just chat. And odds are the majority of my listeners are familiar with both of you, but I do know I've got some new listeners that have just joined in listening on the reg. So let's start off with just some introduction, sort of who you are and what you do, and also a little bit about what led you to working in your current role. Let's kick things off. Angie, what you got for us?
Sure. So I'm Angie Asa-Lovstad, and I come to you from the great state of Iowa. And I have over 20 years of experience in prevention as I led a local coalition here in Kasuth County, eventually ended up leading the statewide coalition called Iowa's Alliance of Coalitions for Change, AC4C, otherwise not ACDC, AC4C. But with that work, we instilled a lot of facilitation techniques and tools, and I knew how well they worked with coalitions across the state of Iowa. And when the opportunity for me to join Hue Life in 2019 came about to really spread my reach with those tools and techniques, I joined Hue Life, which stands for Human Understanding and Engagement. From that, we've been creative in the ways that we can reach folks in the world of prevention. And one of those ways is working with our great partnership with PTTC.
And look at that transition. Hey, Steve, you're up.
Well, my path isn't as straight as Angie's was. Probably, I don't even remember how many years ago that would have been. It has to have been getting close to 30 years ago. I had the opportunity to facilitate and coordinate a DUI intervention program for a person that had received a DUI in the county where I live. And I did that for a number of years. And after a period of time, I used to think, there's got to be something before the red lights go on. I didn't really know anything about formal prevention, per se. And then life took its own twists and turns, and I worked in completely different industries. And then in 2009, I was moved to ask myself about making a career change. And I just got to looking around, and the very first thing that caught my eye was something called a prevention specialist. And I was like, I think that would be pretty cool. I think I could do that. Not really knowing anything about it. And I think that's how most people get into prevention, is not knowing really anything about it. And it's been an interesting journey since then. I joined an organization in Southwest Missouri and learned a lot about the foundations of prevention and how to do prevention, and had been involved with, because my current employer through Missouri was a training and technical assistance provider for the state of Missouri, and had a lot of interactions with ACT Missouri over the 12 years that I was at Community Partnership, Springfield, Missouri. And then Dave Clausen got this idea that he wanted to go into business for himself and start DJC Solutions. And I was contacted about taking Dave Clausen's recognition. And so I went from more of a localized or community-based focus to more of a regional focus through the Mid-America PTC, which is housed out of Acton, Missouri. And like you said, some of your listeners may know, but we focus on Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri and provide training and technical assistance and do an awful lot of work with Hue Life. So we'll talk more about that, I guess, as we get into it.
Yes, indeed. And audience members, Steve just gave you a little glimmer of his intriguing prevention story. And actually, I can put a link in the show notes because as a part of the transition, bringing Steve in and me stepping out, I got to interview him on the Mid-America PTTC podcast, where unpacked his story even more to talk about just a fascinating journey and lots of insights and wisdom that you do bring to the table. Tell us about that podcast, though. What are y'all doing with the PTTC podcast now? Doesn't it have a new name?
It's going to have a new name in the new year. So that's kind of exciting. I've been here right at a year now. And, I've learned a lot about the nuts and the bolts. And I got to thinking, part of that background that I had when I departed from running the DUI program was I worked in radio and television and got a marketing and ad degree. And that really just kind of like that stuff more as a nerd than as a position. So we're going to rebrand our podcast and call it the Prevention Perk. And we will launch that in the new year. And I'm excited about. We now are, I think we're at about 63 episodes. So I've gotten my what is it? I've gotten my chops, or I'm learning them. So time to start doing some innovative things with it. And it's always exciting to come up with something, just play around, I guess, more than anything, and find out if it resonates with the audience.
I'd say it may feel like playing around to us, but those conversations you're having with prevention leaders are making a difference in helping educate and helping lift up prevention as a whole. But it is also fun at the same time. I dig that.
Well, and when you and I talked before I took the position, that I had some curiosity in my previous role about doing a podcast, and we had talked about it, but we never really got it off the ground. And then when this was one of the reasons why I thought it would be exciting, because this is such a growing medium. There's so much room for growth with the podcast realm or with streaming services. And so that's kind of exciting. And it's been fascinating, the people that I've gotten to have conversation with, because I'm hoping that if people listen to a podcast, the reason I'm having this conversation is because the person I'm talking to has intrigued me in some way. And I'm hoping that the audience will find something beneficial out of that conversation as well. I find that to be kind of fascinating about all of this. It's a fun way to introduce our audience to a variety of different professions, experiences, perspectives. I mean, it's really kind of a fun opportunity to really build out the prevention method.
Who are some of those intriguing guests that you've had recently?
One of the podcasts that I just did that was really a lot of fun, and it's because I've known this person for a long time, but she wrote a memoir. Her name is Holly Rader. She is actually a senator for the state of Missouri. And she wrote a story about growing up in a family that struggled with severe mental illness. And also there was some addiction in her family as well. And she's done a fabulous job of depicting what that's like. But she also has done a great job in focusing on the back end of it and talking about being resilient. And she was a huge proponent for the prescription drug monitoring program in the state of Missouri. We were one of the last to adopt a PDMP, and Holly Rader really led that charge for a number of years until it was successfully adopted. So the fascinating story, and you get an understanding as to why she led that charge based upon the story that comes out in her memoir. So that was kind of fun. I actually just had a 2-part series with our partners over at the National Alliance for Drug Endangered Children. I talked to Stacy Reed and Eric Nation on 2 separate occasions to get a perspective. Eric's a previous law enforcement. Stacy worked for Children's Services, and their background and how they got to the point where they are today. And so that was kind of fun to really get to know a little bit more about both of those individuals. And then I think there's a couple of things that I'd like to talk about as we move through here. One of them, as we're looking into the future, is harm reduction. And what does that mean for the current state of prevention, like what we know it as today? And also about best practices, which Dave Clausen knows a little bit about that because you did a 3-part series for us back at the PPPC in the past year. So I think both of those things are going to play a significant role going forward with prevention. So it's nice to have those conversations now and start to evolve.
Absolutely. And listeners, I'll put a link to the Prevention Perk podcast in the show notes, and it is available on all major podcasting platforms. So, Steve, you mentioned the PTTC. You all are working hand in hand, side by side, together, because together is better, with Angie and the marvelous team at Hue Life this year. What all you got in store?
Well, I think some of pretty much what we've been doing. I mean, they've been instrumental in a lot of the work the PTTC has done, especially through the pandemic experience that we all had. I know that was the first time I had learned of Hue Life because they were doing a lot of webinars on how to take your facilitation and your coalition experience into the virtual realm, how to lead those kinds of meetings and how to navigate platforms such as Zoom. So I found that to be valuable early on. I didn't know that I was going to be working as closely with them as it turned out that it was. But, we still do a lot of that in the virtual space. And I think over the next year, Angie and I have talked about some of the ideas that we have. We both share a like-minded belief that there's a need for bringing this conversation, the Hue conversation, into kind of the rural pockets of America. And sometimes I look at rural America as being the really underserved part of the population. It's not to discredit some of the other DEI efforts that go on in our culture today, but I think sometimes we don't step back far enough and look at the idea that rural America really is underserved in a lot of ways. They don't have access to a lot of programs, process services that we do in a more urban core. And so how can we kind of bring a new way of convening the public in those more pockets. And I'm looking forward to what we're able to do, not just the next year, but going forward with Hue Life, because I think they bring a really valuable perspective on how to engage the community in a conversation that really can provide benefit. I mean, it really engages people and builds consensus. And I think that's something that is at the foundation of prevention. How do you get the community to come together and decide what is the issue, which ones of those can really tackle, and how are we going to go about doing it? And you can bring a group of people together for a full day and figure some of that out. It'll eliminate an awful lot of coalition luncheons where we, have a sandwich and talk about the problem. And instead, this is going to hopefully help us take it to the next level.
Right. Well, speaking of taking it to the next level, I'm going to throw the mic over to you, Angie. Steve, you mentioned in your intro facilitating the DUI class. And Angie, you're a facilitator extraordinaire with your roots in the coalition world. Let's first just, how would you describe what is facilitation for our audience members that may have heard the term, but not really have an intimate knowledge or relationship with facilitation or facilitative leadership?
Sure. And we're very familiar with traditional leadership where we tell everyone what they need to do. And I think coalitions started building people around the table saying, here's what our grant is, here's what we need to do. Now let's all sign up for a committee and let's go do it. Well, that didn't work for me back in the day. And in the end, our local coalition, I joke always, but it's true, they only have a miniature golf course as a result, because that was one thing they mastered. They figured out how to purchase a miniature golf course and they run it quite well. But we lost all the strategies because back in the day, that was the kind of leader I was. But I learned facilitative methods and I'm like, oh, and still to this day, I do some coaching with Iowa in their health and human services. And as we look at those coalition leaders and we teach them how to have that Hue conversation that Steve's talking about, where we really identify what everyone brings to the table and what they really are jazzed about and what are some of the real struggles that we see in our community. That collective vision that comes from having that individual conversation really drives people into thinking they could do something different. And if we don't do something different, we may be stuck in this problem for a long time, and that drives people to action. So what I like to say is facilitation is about really helping people understand how to engage one another to create community level change. And by leaving it in the wisdom within the group, that allows all those stakeholders to feel like they have a place at the table.
So stakeholders, lots of different people, perspectives, diverse thinkers, diverse background, diverse experiences. How do you navigate? How do you bring everybody together for that collective vision and ideally leading to that collective action that is coalition work?
Honestly, it usually starts with some grant funding that says we have to.
Mm-hmm.
But once they come to the table, that you show appreciation. And one way that we have identified through our coalition trainings and such, we really dive into the circles of involvement and where do people sit on the circles of involvement? How much does their personal why, the why they do their work, why they feel like they're invested in this cause, they would do this work even if they weren't paid to do this work. That why aligns with the purpose of the collective. They're more likely to stay at the table and continue to come even when the money's not there. And so really identifying that capacity piece in a way that aligns with individuals' perspectives and their purpose, their why, and the work that they do.
That's one of the things that I've really liked about experience I've had over the last year with Prevention Leaders Cohort, but primarily around the why, because for a number of years doing the prevention work where I originally started, that was one of the questions that always came up was, why are you here? And I would always try to illustrate, but I didn't really have the tools or the technique to really drill down like I'm learning to do now and really help understand that why. But, on the outset, what I was always asking people is, why are you here? And they would say, well, I want to make a difference, or it's a problem in our community or something like that. But really getting up underneath the hood and finding out, why are you really here? Really personalizing your experience with community involvement. And if it's, the use prevention, or if it's suicide prevention or harm reduction or whatever it happens to be, but really getting underneath of it and finding out where the individual is coming from, because then there's kind of a stick-to-itiveness to it. It's like, oh, now I'm really invested because I found out for myself why this. And I think that that's fascinating, because the reason I used to ask that question, like, why are you here, is when I was a professional fundraiser, the gentleman that taught me, he was a consultant that taught me a lot about how to do that effectively. He used to always say, find out where it itches and then scratch. And I used to think that's really interesting, because that's how you'll find out where a person's coming from, who a person really is. And I think that's true when it comes to the prevention work. You find out, really, why are you sitting here at the table? And then really get them to tell on themselves the importance for actually sticking around and helping to make a difference. And I think that's one of the practices that I've learned through the PLC, is to really understand, because I've been doing this a long time, but really understand my whys about things, not just professionally, but personally as well. And I think that that's invaluable.
So I think what, Steve, you're referring to is the Simon Sinek's part when we do. So the Prevention Leaders Cohort he talks about is divided over 15 months, and each quarter focuses on one segment of the Strategic Prevention Framework, the SPIF. So of course we start with assessment, and we do some things with assessment and personal assessment and where you are at as an individual. But when we start building capacity, we're starting to look at the why and identify the stories that are behind that. Chandler for Prevention Leaders too came through, and she wasn't going to be available. So she recorded her story. And one thing about evaluation we talk about is telling a story and how important that is, bringing it to life, because people need to understand what it really looks like. Prevention's hard to really see in the numbers, right? And it changes slowly. We're making community level change. It doesn't happen overnight, but we can see the evolution of it. And as Chandler talks about it, she proudly proclaimed herself as a people-focused, collaborative, empathetic preventionist that learned that being a chicken was essential. And with that, her 15-month journey included several components that chicken spells out, but one of them was really to understand her why and how that really helped her uncover her journey to becoming a preventionist. And so through her early childhood experiences that is described in this video that she put together for our final Prevention Leaders Cohort, she tells the story about how her early encounters with smoking and marijuana that really led her away from that choice and into a field of prevention later on. And she continued to do her journey. So I think that's really cool when people get to uncover their passion points and what was the pinnacle point in their life that really changed them to a point of, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And this has purpose. That's what keeps us at the table.
Start with why. Not just because it's an amazing, life-changing book, but it is ever so important. And like you both said, will help align both individual whys and the organization, the coalition's why, build that buy-in, that commitment. Absolutely. And gosh, I don't remember when you said it, Angie, but I know you're the one that said it. You talked about how oftentimes in prevention, we'll start with why. We know why we need to do something. And we may have funding that says, hey, here's what you need to do. Here's your work plan. Here's your deliverables. But then when it comes to the how, that is often missing. How do you develop your team? How do you empower? How do you engage? How do you motivate your coalition, your stakeholders to action? And that's the beauty that I see in bringing facilitation and prevention together. Facilitation is the how, the process. And y'all had already hinted at or talked about Hue Conversation. Conversations are oh so important and oh so powerful. You think about prevention. Where do you go a day without having a conversation with somebody? Every day you do. And that's how you're going to start to create change. But let's unpack that a little bit. Who wants to tell me what is Hue Conversations?
You want to be quizzed, Steve, or do you want me to take this one?
Go for it, Angie.
So the Hue Conversation is foundational to everything. And we really dive into the way people think, because we have all types of thinkers that come to our table, and we need to be able to be inclusive of those folks so they feel like they have a purpose at the table. And so we have database thinkers, and we need to ask questions that really ground us in the facts and the figures. And then we have those that are really emotive type thinkers. And those are the folks that just need to explore what's out there, how people are processing that information. What does it mean for you? What does it mean for me? And as those emotive thinkers start teasing those ideas out, that's kicking into gear for those visionary thinkers, hearing all those ideas, how we take in the information, the way we like or dislike something. Those visionary thinkers are starting to come into play, and they're getting new ideas. And then we have some critical thinkers that say, yeah, but before we can move into action, we need to consider this or that. And then we have those that are just been dying to move into action from the very get-go. And the cool thing is that we have a little bit of all these in us, but some of us live in one space more than the other. And so as you think about it, in coalition meetings, for instance, you present the information of the latest report, and you have some folks that react to it. And that kind of helps shape what we could possibly do in the community with that information that we brought to the table. And oftentimes, this is where our coalition leaders kind of make the mistake, is they like, okay, we've got all these great ideas. Who's going to do what? And we don't have any, we have the summary from the coalition leader, and then it's like, let's meet next month. Instead, this says, now what part of this really draws you in? What are you going to do between now and the next time? So leaving it in that state of action allows that how to come out. And so the other piece that I heard you say, Dave, is, the figuring out what tool out of your toolbox can you pull to really engage folks the best. So we're continuing our journey around the SPIF, the Strategic Prevention Framework. We're really looking at the tools that can go into planning, right? And so when do you need to pull out the conversation, which builds that shared awareness? Or maybe you need to get to some shared agreement. And so we're going to do some consensus building then. Perhaps it's more taking people on a journey. And so figuring out where you're at in your planning stage and what tool you need. I think that's one of the gifts that we bring through our work.
The Hue Conversation Method. Random plug, y'all, listeners, if you're local to Indiana, Hue Life's coming to Carmel, Indiana at the end of February for an in-person training. the Hue Conversation Method. So check out the link in the show notes and come join me. Let's have some conversations together. Okay, back to the podcast. Conversations, yes. And one of the things that I love about it is, for me, believe it or not, y'all, I tend to be a little more introverted than extroverted. When I've been at coalition meetings, when I've been at any meeting, it doesn't take much for me to disengage, to shut down, to be quiet and not want to share my voice, because there might be a strong voice in the room, or the conversation method, if there even is one, doesn't create space for all the different types of thinkers to comfortably share their voice. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Hue Conversation Method. It creates space for all the different thinkers because it's built on personality theory and brain science. Like, I get people that say, well, Dave, I have a conversation. I know how to have a conversation. But do you know how to have a conversation that's built on personality theory and brain science? Think about that one, y'all. So we've been talking about the Prevention Leaders Cohort because it is coming up. Registration is open and it kicks off in March 2023, so just a few months away. It is essentially 15 months jam-packed with tools, building your toolbox all around, all built on the Hue Conversation Method, means to engage different types of thinkers, different stakeholders, how to bring them together in alignment towards the mission of creating safer, healthier communities, more effective coalitions, more effective teams. It's not just for coalition leaders. Who are some of the positions? Is it a good fit, Angie, for somebody that, say, runs a regional prevention team or a statewide prevention team?
Yes, of course. We've had everything. And that's what's really cool about it. And Steve, you can talk to your experience of being mixed up with other folks in different states. You know, when we came to the pandemic, we were like, okay, what do our coalition folks need out there? And so this is where it emerged from. We decided that, you know, we could package this around the spiff and really put all the tools into one package. What we didn't intend, and what was a result of it, and, you know, the PTTC helped us get folks from different states too, but we had like 7 states in the first cohort. And that mixture of folks from across different states, identifying that we have similar issues, we have similar challenges, there's similar solutions that we all could do. And then finding that support was the unrealized benefit of doing the Prevention Leaders Cohort in a virtual space. And we continue to seek out to have multiple states represented in the cohorts so that you have that cross representation. And yeah, Steve, you're part of our PLC4 right now.
I know. I'm going to actually be officially graduated on Wednesday of this week.
Yeah.
That'd be my 15th and final session with the PLC. And to answer the question about, you know, the size of audience or if it's, you know, applicable, just in the short experience that I've had, Angie and her coworkers came out we were out in Western Kansas and Western Nebraska, and we did a rural road show where we just went to different communities in both of those more rural areas. And we had, you know, I think the largest audience we had was right around 20 people. And then just this past month, we had a whole host of people from New Life gather together in Missouri because they wrangled a crowd over a 2-day period with 100. And what's interesting is you get the same, not the same result in that what needs to be done in Western Kansas needs to be done across the state of Missouri, but the same result in that the consensus was built, that people were engaged in it, that people were excited about it, that people wanted to take the next step. I mean, I've seen people, they stood up, you know, over a 2-day period and shared their experience. Sometimes it was really very for people to be as transparent as they were. But then through this process, it was interesting to watch everybody kind of come together. And what's interesting about that is there's a skit that was done during the process where they actually used the song Come Together to illustrate their experience. And it was almost like it just kind of catapulted everybody to a new level of energy. And then when they were signing up for what they would do next steps, there was no shortage. There wasn't like, well, you know, Dave, or Angie. It was like, there were people kind of like, I want to be involved with this and I want to that, and I understand this, and I have expertise in that. And it was just like, it was really interesting because you had an opportunity for everybody to be heard and then for everybody to kind of start thinking, not going to get my way all the way, but I can understand and respect where everybody's coming from, and we can get started on going in a particular direction. And I think that was part of it. And I let Angie, she done a much better job. I would have came up with DEVCA and then struggled with how do I define what DEVCA is and whether the audience knows that or not. When she talked about data and emotive and visionary and critical and action oriented, she's talking about the personality profile. And through all of this work that we did, whether it was with 10 or 15 people or with 100 people, bringing out all of those parts of their personality, who they are, and bringing that to the table. And on the outset, I would think, nightmare, how are you going to wrangle all these cats? The audience really learns to work together. And if 100 people can do that over a 2-day period, a community can learn to do that over a period of time as well. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that it gets everybody heard. Because as we've been talking about this, I think, I'm a part of this, just like everyone else. I live in a very fragmented world because of, one, social media, but two, because we went through this pandemic and there's just this pervasive isolation. And I don't know anybody that's been doing prevention for any period of time that would disagree with this. The real effective change happens in a community when the community decides to make the change. And that's not Steve doing it or Angie doing it or Dave doing it. It's when the community says, this is not healthy for our community. Now we need to figure out a consensus on how to deal with this. And it brings everybody together, and it gives them the short wins that they need to see. And then based upon those short wins, then they can be effective for the long term and make some of that community or some of that environmental or systemic change that needs to happen so that we can reduce substance.
I would love to come back and paint the story of that skit that you talked about, Steve, because one thing I think that is really, really important that we create is a safe space, right? It wasn't until our last day. Had we done that activity the very first day, this person would not have probably been brave enough. But it was a young Black woman who stood up on the final day of this facilitation and said, I want y'all to look around the room. What do you notice? There's not people like me in this room. And so the skit started, and we're referencing back to Chandler's story that I missed earlier. And maybe it was something that came out of Prevention Leaders. I don't know, but she reiterated it in her story. But diversity is being invited to the party. So this young Black woman was invited to the party. But inclusivity is being asked and invited to dance. And so with that, they created this skit where she was laying on the stage, broken and not supported. And one by one, they brought the community supports made out of pipe cleaners to her and handed her as the song Come Together was being played. And then the more supports that she was brought to and the more love that was shown upon her, the stronger and the higher she stood on the stage until she was in the center of the circle and she was dancing with everyone. And they literally were dancing on the stage afterward. So I think that's an important part, is creating that safety. It's one thing to say we got a diverse group of folks that are around our table. But if you're not asking them to dance in the same level and have an equal playing field, and that's really what we're saying the Hue Conversation can do, is allow all voices to be heard and let them dance at the table the same as the rest.
I can only imagine the impact that skit had on the folks in the room. I mean, I started to get chills just picturing it. Talk about powerful. Oh, goodness. And that was in a room full of 100 people from across the state, strangers. Definitely speaks to that safety piece.
And let's say there were some power players. We had the state legislators were there along with SAMHSA and folks that were federal level and folks that were in recovery. So all aspects. So
I think that's the other thing about this whole process. When you bring some of these, you can do this at a high level, like across the state. You can do this in your community. You can do it in your neighborhood. You can do it for yourself. And I think that's the interesting thing, because it's really about having conversation with yourself being authentic with yourself about that conversation and then asking yourself, okay, this is working or this isn't working. And if it's not working, then what are my options for moving forward to addressing that? And if you can build a consensus on that, then that's the problem in half. You're well on your way because the community's agreed that this is something done, or the individual or the state, whatever it happens. I think that's really that's what's embedded in like doing something like the Prevention Leaders Cohort, is really learning a little bit about all of the elements, but through that lens, also learning a little bit about yourself through experience, so that, you teach best what you need to know most. And so kind of bringing yourself into that experience and then being able to share that with other people.
Yes, that personal transformation. As I learn these methods, these tools, I gain more insight into myself, but then also you're going to feel even more empowered, more fired up, more capable, more confident about being able to go out and bring people together to create change. Now, I feel like we've hit on the benefits, the impact that comes from the 15-month Prevention Leaders Cohort journey. Some of the opportunities, we'll get into a few more there, but I'm curious, what would you both say to somebody that might be a little hesitant? Like, I don't know, 15 months. What would you say to somebody that might be a little hesitant about jumping off into the Prevention Leaders Cohort?
Well, I think for me personally, Angie heard this a lot. I think it was probably not until about the sixth session. I mean, I'm going along with it. I'm like, yeah, session to session. But in my mind, I'm thinking, what is going on here? Because it's really about reframing the way you look at this. I'm going to say holistically. You look at it yourself. You look at it in community. You look at it across the region, across the state, and nationally, whatever. It reframes the way you look at really interacting with yourself, but also with other people. And you don't really learn that in a 1 hour, breakout session at a conference, or a 2 hour webinar, or even a 2-day series or something like that. This is really something you need a chance to experience, take a break from, detach from, and then come back to and see how all the pieces fit together. Because it is a big elephant to chew, and 15 months is a long time. But unless you're a pretty high functioning individual to begin with, and I can already take myself off the table there, you're going to need the time to really understand the components of it. And I would say give yourself a gift, because it takes some time. And I'm going to complete it but that certainly doesn't mean I've mastered anything. It's one of those things where you used to unpack for you as you continue to unpack it. And so, I would say jump in, because, I've talked about this with other people that I've worked with, or people that I know, and they're like, you can just see, and they're like, I want to be that. It's like they can see the benefit of it in the way that it's described, but then you have to make the decision, am I going to make investment? Investment is really not about the dollars and the cents. The investment, am I going to work? And that's where all the difference is made.
Yeah. And I think when you look at the 15 months, it goes fast, doesn't it, Steve?
Oh, yeah. Well, and I always think I would have been 15 months older anyway, so I might as well do it.
We break those 15 months down into the sessions are only 3 hour. Each month we have 2 3-hour sessions. So it doesn't take your whole day. And the camaraderie that you build between your cohort it's a journey that you're going on together. And we do create space for you to be that vulnerable self. And I think that's probably the most surprising thing, because it is about you as a leader and how do you show up and what are the aspects of your leader. I think, as you said, Steve, that had a shift a way you approached things, made you think a little differently, challenged you on some of the ways that you had been, and how could you be better going forward? And so it's through that and being supported and hearing similar stories from others, I think, is the power of, we say something like prevention is better together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true for this cohort as well.
Absolutely. And I would say too, my 2 cents, because I'm the host and I can do that, right? But it's a journey, true learning and transformation. And if you really want to embed the new learnings, the skills, it takes time. like Steve was saying, it's not a one instant thing. If you're an athlete, a basketball player, you go out and hour workshop, hey, here's how you shoot a 3-pointer. You think you mastered that? Do you think you have a good handle on the craft of that skill? No, you need to practice. You get your reps in, get feedback together from others. Learning is a journey, and that journey is best traveled together with others. So yes, folks, I'll put the link, of course, in the show notes to the website so you can learn some more about the Prevention Leaders Cohort or Hue Conversations. We've covered a lot here, and y'all shared a lot of wisdom, a lot of insights that I didn't even have in my notes to ask about. So thank you both for doing that. Before we close out, I want to open it up to first Angie and then Steve. Any final takeaways, any last thoughts? Or one of my favorite is, if you're going to remember one thing, remember this. What you got for us, Angie and then Steve?
You're going to remember one thing. They have to make space for all the folks around the table to be heard, to feel included and feel like they have value to be able to contribute to make that community level change happen. And there's processes that can be learned to be able to do that.
All right, Steve.
You know, one of the things that I think about, and I believe this is how it should be, prevention is consistently changing. What's interesting is that the components for effective prevention work don't really change. It's the community, right? It's making a difference in your community where you're at. And it is changing. Something to keep in mind is learning how to navigate that change. And I think that through a process like learning the Hue Conversation and some of the skills that they will teach an individual, it really helps us to better understand how to navigate that change. So hold on to that and then sign up for the next.
Yes, indeed. Sign up for the next course and subscribe to Prevention Perks podcast as well, so you can stay in touch with Steve. And I can't thank you both enough. Y'all know my motto, prevention is better together, but it is by far much better together with you both. Thank you for having this conversation with me today and many more to come. That concludes this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and share this episode with a friend before you leave. And we look forward to seeing you on social media, because prevention is better together. Together, we are stronger.